The evening was calm, and the sun was slowly setting behind the tall buildings of the city. The streets were filled with people going home from work, mothers holding their children's hands, and shopkeepers closing their stores for the day. Among them walked Marcus Johnson, a man in his late 30s with a simple and humble appearance. He wore dark trousers, a plain shirt, and carried a small bag over his shoulder. To anyone looking, he seemed like an ordinary man returning home after a long day. His steps were steady, his eyes calm, and his presence quiet. Yet inside, Marcus carried more than just a bag. He carried years of discipline, strength, and a badge that symbolized responsibility. But no one around him knew that secret at that moment. As Marcus walked down the street, a police patrol car slowed down near him. 4 officers sat inside, their voices loud with laughter that spilled into the open air. They noticed Marcus walking alone and exchanged looks. Without much thought, they pulled the car over to the side of the road. The sound of the tires screeching made Marcus glance back. He did not stop immediately, instead, he kept his pace steady. But the officers stepped out, and their voices cut through the noise of the street. "Hey, you there, stop right now," one officer shouted, his tone sharp and demanding. Marcus paused, took a slow breath, and turned to face them. His calm eyes met their stern expressions. He could already feel what was coming, but he remained steady. "What's the problem, officer?" Marcus asked politely, keeping his voice low and respectful. The tallest of the officers stepped closer, looking Marcus up and down with suspicion. "Where are you going? What are you carrying? You look out of place here." His words were harsh, spoken loudly so that people passing by could hear. A few pedestrians stopped, curious about the scene. Marcus adjusted the strap of his bag and replied, "I'm just going home from work." The officer smirked, then turned to his colleagues as if Marcus's answer was not good enough. Another officer joined in, saying, "You people always have the same excuse. Show us what's in your bag." Marcus nodded and calmly handed his bag over. They opened it roughly and searched through the contents: some papers, a water bottle, and a few personal items. Finding nothing unusual, they still weren't satisfied. The tallest officer returned the bag with a cold stare. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. By now, a small crowd had started to gather nearby. People whispered among themselves, pulling out their phones to record the situation. Marcus could feel dozens of eyes on him, watching closely, waiting for what would happen next. He remained calm, though inside his heart beat faster. He knew well how situations like this could easily get out of control. The officers surrounded Marcus, making it clear they had no intention of letting him go quickly. One officer sneered, "Why are you so calm, huh? Got something to hide?" Most people get nervous when police stop them. Marcus shook his head slightly. "I have nothing to hide. I'm just trying to go home." His words were simple, but they carried quiet strength. The officers exchanged looks again. They didn't like his composure. They wanted him nervous, broken, embarrassed. One officer pushed further, "Empty your pockets. Let's see what you're carrying there." Marcus slowly reached into his pockets, pulling out his keys and a small wallet. He handed them over without hesitation. They opened the wallet, flipping through it, but did not notice the most important thing tucked deep inside. They returned it with a scowl. Still not satisfied, the officers started raising their voices louder, almost like a performance for the crowd. "What are you really doing here?" shouted one. "Why don't you just admit it? You're hiding something." Marcus stood tall, though his patience was being tested. He kept his voice soft. "I told you already. I'm just going home." But the officers wanted more. The tallest one leaned closer and said, "If you've got nothing to hide, then prove it. Take off your jacket." The demand shocked some in the crowd. A woman nearby whispered, Why are they asking him to do that? That's not right. Others shook their heads, but no one stepped forward. Marcus looked at the officer for a moment, then slowly removed his jacket and held it out. They searched it roughly, found nothing, and tossed it back. Instead of being satisfied, they pushed further. Take off your shirt too. Let's make sure you're not hiding anything underneath. The request was humiliating, and Marcus knew it. He felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, watching, recording, judging. He wanted to resist, to tell them no, but he also knew that refusing could make things worse. So, he slowly began unbuttoning his shirt. His hands were steady, though his heart pounded. The air grew heavy with tension. Some in the crowd murmured in disbelief, others gasped, while children clutched their parents' hands tighter. One little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked innocently, "Why are they making him do that?" The mother pulled him close, unable to answer. Marcus slipped off his shirt and handed it over. The officers patted it down roughly, finding nothing once again. Their faces twisted with frustration. They were looking for something to justify their actions, but they found nothing at all. Yet, instead of stopping, they only grew more determined to break him. The tall officer's voice rose above the noise of the street. "Don't just stand there looking calm. If you're clean, keep proving it. Show us everything." His words were sharp, meant to humiliate Marcus further in front of strangers. Marcus looked at the officer, his eyes calm but filled with quiet pain. He knew what they were doing, but he refused to let them see fear in him. Instead, he took a deep breath and held his ground. His silence seemed to anger them even more. The crowd grew larger, the murmurs louder, phones raised high, recording every moment. The humiliation was public, but Marcus's dignity remained untouched. He stood tall, not lowering his head, not begging for mercy. Though the officers thought they were in control, Marcus knew something they didn't. Deep inside his pocket, untouched so far, lay the one item that would change everything. The badge, his badge, the truth of who he really was. But he chose not to reveal it yet. He wanted them to show their true colors first, to expose their actions before he revealed his. The scene closed with Marcus standing there, shirtless, under the fading evening light, surrounded by a crowd that whispered in shock. The officers, still circling him, were blind to the storm they were about to face. And Marcus, calm as ever, prepared for the moment when truth would rise above humiliation. The crowd around Marcus grew larger as the officers continued their questioning. The flashing lights of the patrol car painted the walls and faces of onlookers in red and blue. People whispered, recorded on their phones, and some shook their heads in disbelief. The evening that had started calmly was now charged with tension. Marcus stood without his jacket and shirt, trying to keep his breathing even. His chest rose and fell steadily, but deep inside, his heart beat faster. He had been trained for difficult moments, but never had he thought he would face humiliation like this in front of strangers while holding back the truth about who he really was. The tallest officer smirked, stepping closer, his voice filled with arrogance. "See? You don't look so tough now, do you? People like you think you can walk around without answering questions. Well, not here. Not today." His words were cruel, meant to reduce Marcus to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of everyone present. Another officer circled behind Marcus, tapping his baton lightly against his palm, staring at Marcus as if waiting for the slightest sign of resistance. "Maybe he's hiding something under his pants," the officer said, his tone mocking. The suggestion caused a stir in the crowd. Mothers pulled their children closer, worried about what they might see. An elderly man in the back muttered under his breath, "This has gone too far." Marcus clenched his fists briefly, then relaxed them. He had to remain calm. If he let anger control him, the officers would use it against him. He looked at them and spoke softly, "I've done nothing wrong. I told you already. I'm just trying to go home. But the words fell on deaf ears. The officers wanted to break him further. The crowd watched as one of them stepped forward, pointing at Marcus's shoes. Take them off. Empty them. Let's make sure you're not hiding anything. Slowly, Marcus bent down, removed his shoes, and handed them over. The officer shook them upside down, banged them against the car, and then tossed them aside with disdain. Finding nothing, he shrugged but didn't apologize. He simply joined the others, circling Marcus again. The humiliation was deliberate now. They had already checked his bag, his pockets, his jacket, his shirt, and now his shoes, but still, they pressed on. The tall officer raised his voice again, louder than before, so that everyone in the crowd could hear. You think you're smarter than us? You think you can just walk around without explanation? Not in front of me. His eyes narrowed. Drop your trousers. Now. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. People gasped, some even shouted, "That's not right." One woman stepped forward but was pulled back by her husband, afraid of what might happen if she interfered. The little boy who had spoken earlier tugged at his mother again and whispered, "Why are they doing this to him, Mom? He didn't do anything." The mother's eyes filled with tears, but she held her son close, unable to answer. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength. He could feel the weight of shame pressing against him, but he also knew this was not just about him anymore. Everyone watching would remember how he responded. If he broke down, if he shouted, if he fought back, the officers would use it as proof of guilt. But if he stood tall, if he remained calm, then the truth would shine brighter when the moment finally came. He opened his eyes and slowly loosened his belt. The crowd fell into a heavy silence. Even those who were recording held their breath. With steady hands, Marcus lowered his trousers and handed them to the officers. His dignity was tested, but his eyes remained focused, strong, and unshaken. The officers searched the trousers roughly, shaking them, turning the pockets inside out. They found nothing again. Frustration spread across their faces. They wanted control, but Marcus's silence, his quiet strength, made them look weaker with every passing second. One of the officers cursed under his breath, clearly annoyed that they hadn't uncovered anything. "This isn't over," he muttered. He turned to the others, then looked back at Marcus. "You think standing quiet makes you look innocent? It doesn't. It makes you look guilty." But the crowd no longer believed that. Murmurs of disapproval rose louder now. People were whispering words like unfair, shameful, and disgrace. The balance was shifting, and the officers seemed blind to it. Marcus stood there in silence, wearing only his undershirt and dignity. The flashing lights continued, the cameras recorded, and the city's hum seemed to fade into the background. He was the center of attention, but not by choice. He endured it because he knew the truth was still in his pocket. He knew that when it was revealed, the humiliation would not belong to him but to those who forced him into this moment. The tallest officer, still unsatisfied, leaned close, his face almost inches from Marcus's. "What's in your other pocket?" he asked, his voice sharp. He had checked everything, but his pride demanded that he push further. Marcus looked at him quietly. His hand moved slowly toward his pocket. The crowd leaned in, waiting, holding their breath. The officers watched eagerly, expecting something that would finally justify their treatment of him. Marcus's fingers brushed against the object inside, smooth, firm, familiar. His badge. He held it for a moment, still inside his pocket, choosing not to reveal it just yet. He wanted the officers to dig their own grave deeper, to expose themselves fully before the truth broke them. He withdrew his hand and shook his head slightly. "There's nothing there you need to see right now," he said calmly. The officers scowled, but the crowd gasped. His refusal was not out of fear but out of strength. Everyone could see it now. He wasn't trembling, he wasn't breaking down, he wasn't begging for mercy. He was enduring. He was resisting not with violence, but with dignity. An older man in the crowd spoke up loudly, "Let him be. You've searched everything. Enough is enough." His voice was followed by others, murmurs turning into shouts of support. The officers turned angrily toward the crowd, but they couldn't silence so many voices. Marcus stood in the center of it all, calm, tall, and steady. His body carried the marks of humiliation, but his spirit stood untouched. The night had become heavier, the tension thicker, but the truth was still waiting inside his pocket, hidden yet powerful. He knew the moment of revelation was coming soon, and when it did, everything would change. The officers, blind to their own downfall, continued circling him, unaware that their authority was slipping away with every second. The crowd no longer saw Marcus as a suspect, they saw him as a man standing with quiet courage against abuse of power. And Marcus, though tired, though tested, was ready. Ready for the moment when the badge would leave his pocket and turn humiliation into justice. The air was heavy with tension as Marcus stood surrounded by flashing lights, a circle of officers, and the growing crowd. By now, there were at least 50 people watching, some recording quietly, others whispering angrily among themselves. The scene had changed from a routine stop to a public spectacle, and Marcus was right in the middle of it. He had already given up his bag, his jacket, his shirt, and even his shoes. Still, the officers pressed on, their voices sharp, their eyes burning with suspicion. But Marcus held his ground, calm and silent, knowing something they did not. The tallest officer, who had led the harassment from the start, stepped closer again. His pride was bruised because nothing incriminating had been found. He could feel the judgmental stares of the crowd, the disapproving whispers, and the raised cameras. He wanted to show strength, to prove authority, but the more he pushed, the more it seemed to slip away. "Don't think standing quiet makes you innocent," he barked at Marcus. "You're still hiding something." Marcus lifted his head and met the man's eyes. His voice was soft but steady. "I told you already. I have nothing to hide." But instead of calming the situation, his quiet response only seemed to irritate the officer further. He turned to the others. "Search him again. Check everything. If he's this calm, then something's wrong." The other officers obeyed. They patted Marcus down roughly, checking the same pockets they had already emptied, searching his trousers again, even shaking his socks. The crowd groaned at the sight, their voices rising louder with disapproval. One woman shouted, "Enough! You already searched him." Another man added, "You're embarrassing yourselves. Let him go." But the officers ignored the voices. They wanted to push Marcus to the breaking point. They wanted him to lose control, to shout, to resist, so they could claim he was aggressive. Yet Marcus refused to give them that satisfaction. He stood like a stone in the middle of the storm, allowing their hands to push and pat, but never raising his own in anger. Finally, one officer's hand brushed against Marcus's pocket, the one he had not yet revealed. He felt something inside, small and hard. His eyes lit up with a strange excitement. "Aha," he said loudly, pulling his hand back. "What's in this pocket, huh? Looks like you were hiding something all along." The tall officer's lips curved into a cruel smile. "Take it out," he ordered. The crowd leaned forward, phones raised higher, holding their breath for what was about to happen. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately. He slipped his hand into his pocket and wrapped his fingers around the object inside. He knew this was the moment. The humiliation, the taunts, the stares, all of it had led to this point. He pulled out a small black wallet, worn from years of use, but neat and well kept. He held it in his hand for a moment, then extended it toward the officer. The officer snatched it eagerly, like a predator catching prey. He opened it in front of everyone, expecting to find something that would justify their cruelty: drugs, weapons, fake IDs, anything. But when his eyes fell on what was inside, his confident smile froze. The crowd, restless and silent, waited for him to reveal it. There, neatly tucked inside the wallet, was a police badge. Shiny, official, undeniable. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he stared at it. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The crowd gasped loudly, their voices breaking into shocked murmurs. People who had been holding their breath now exhaled in disbelief. Phones zoomed closer, capturing every detail of the moment. Marcus looked straight into the officer's eyes and spoke with a calmness that cut deeper than any shout. "That badge belongs to me. I am Detective Marcus Johnson, working undercover. You never asked who I was. You only saw what you wanted to see." The silence that followed was deafening. The officers froze, their faces pale. The tall officer's jaw dropped slightly as the realization sank in. He had not just humiliated an innocent man, he had humiliated one of their own. The crowd erupted. Some shouted angrily, others clapped in support of Marcus, and many voiced their outrage at the officers. "Shame on you," cried one woman. "He told you he had nothing to hide," shouted another. The little boy who had been asking questions earlier now said loudly, "See, Mom. He was telling the truth." Marcus stood tall, holding his head high. He had endured everything in silence, waiting for this moment. And now the truth was out for all to see. The officers' faces burned red with embarrassment. Their hands that had been so quick to push and search now hung helplessly at their sides. The tall officer tried to recover his authority, but his voice shook. "We didn't know." "You should have told us," Marcus interrupted him, his voice steady and powerful. "It was never about what I told you. It was about what you chose to believe. You didn't ask. You didn't listen. You judged me by what you saw, not by who I am." The crowd cheered, clapping and shouting in agreement. The officers looked smaller now, their uniforms no longer symbols of strength but reminders of their shame. They had tried to strip Marcus of his dignity, but instead, they had stripped themselves of theirs. One officer stammered, We were just following procedure." Marcus shook his head slowly. "No. You were not following procedure. You were following prejudice." His words hit like thunder, ringing in the ears of everyone present. The tension in the air shifted. The power that the officers had tried to hold onto had slipped completely into Marcus's hands. The people no longer saw him as a suspect, they saw him as a man of courage, a man who had faced humiliation with strength and revealed the truth without anger or violence. The tall officer's voice cracked as he tried again to defend himself. You set us up. You wanted this to happen." Marcus looked at him with calm eyes. "No. You set yourselves up. I gave you every chance to stop. But you chose to keep going. This moment you created it." The crowd erupted again, their voices rising louder, drowning out the officer's shame. Phones captured every second, ensuring the world beyond that street would soon know the truth. Marcus took his badge from the officer's trembling hands and placed it back in his pocket. He straightened his shoulders and looked at the people around him. His dignity was intact, his truth shining brighter than the flashing lights of the patrol car. He had reached the breaking point, but instead of breaking, he had risen. The badge in his pocket was no longer just metal, it was a symbol of justice, a reminder that truth cannot be hidden, no matter how much others try to bury it under humiliation. And as Marcus stood tall, the officers finally realized that they had not humiliated him. They had humiliated themselves. The street was buzzing with noise after Marcus revealed his badge. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts, their voices blending into a wave of disbelief and anger. People pushed closer, holding their phones higher to capture the officers' shocked faces. Mothers who had tried to shield their children earlier now pointed toward Marcus, whispering about his bravery. The truth was out, and it spread like fire through the crowd. Marcus had been humiliated, stripped of his dignity piece by piece, but in the end, the truth had reversed everything. He was not a criminal. He was not a suspect. He was a detective, one of the very men sworn to protect the city. The tallest officer stood frozen, his jaw tight and his hands trembling. His voice, once loud and commanding, was now weak and uncertain. This can't be right. You should have told us earlier. His words were shaky, and even as he spoke them, he knew how hollow they sounded. The other officers shifted nervously, their eyes darting between Marcus and the angry crowd. They had all felt powerful just moments ago, but now they looked small, their uniforms no longer symbols of authority but reminders of their mistake. Marcus did not raise his voice, but his calm words cut deeper than a shout. "I gave you chances," he said. "You searched my bag. You searched my clothes. You searched my shoes. Every time you found nothing, but you pushed harder. Not because of procedure, but because of prejudice. You didn't see me. You only saw what you wanted me to be." The crowd roared with agreement. Some clapped, others shouted, "That's right." A man's voice rang out, "You treated him like dirt, and now look at yourselves." Another woman shouted, "We all saw it. You can't deny it now." The officers turned red, their faces stiff as they tried to hold their ground. One officer whispered to the tall leader, "We should walk away. This is bad." But the tall officer shook his head, still desperate to regain control. He pointed at Marcus and said loudly, "You were undercover. How were we supposed to know? You can't blame us for doing our jobs." Marcus looked at him steadily, his voice calm yet powerful. "Doing your job doesn't mean humiliating someone in public. Doing your job doesn't mean stripping a man of his dignity without reason. You weren't protecting anyone tonight, you were feeding your pride." The crowd clapped and cheered louder. Their voices overwhelmed the officer's authority, and for the first time, the men in uniform felt the weight of being judged. Their actions had been exposed, not just to the people standing there, but to the world beyond, because every phone held high meant their shame would spread across news stations and social media by morning. One of the younger officers lowered his head, unable to look Marcus in the eye. He mumbled, "We made a mistake." His words were quiet, but the crowd heard them. Cheers rose again, voices demanding justice and accountability. But the tall officer still fought against the tide. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "You set us up. You wanted this to happen." Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His presence was strong, not because of anger, but because of the calm dignity he carried even after all he had endured. He interrupted, his words sharp but controlled. "No, I didn't set you up. You set yourselves up. I stood here, silent, patient, and you kept going. You wanted me to break. But the only thing broken here tonight is your pride." The officer's face twisted, but he had no reply. The truth had left him speechless. His colleagues stood behind him, avoiding Marcus's eyes, knowing the detective's words were undeniable. The crowd's energy shifted now. Their anger burned hotter, not just against the officers, but in defense of Marcus. People began chanting, "Justice! Justice!" Others demanded apologies. A woman pushed closer and shouted, "Say sorry to him. Right here, in front of everyone." The tall officer's lips tightened. His pride battled with the reality of the situation. But his silence only made things worse. The crowd shouted louder, their voices echoing down the street. Marcus raised his hand gently, signaling for the crowd to calm. His voice was steady, carrying over the noise. "I don't need your apologies. Apologies mean nothing if nothing changes. What matters is that you remember this moment. You can't erase what happened tonight. Everyone here saw it. Everyone here will remember. The crowd quieted, listening intently. Marcus continued, his words clear and strong. This is not about me. It's about what happens every day when people are judged by how they look instead of who they are. You thought you could strip me of my dignity, but dignity doesn't come from clothes. It doesn't come from what's in my bag. Dignity comes from within. And no one can take that from me. The crowd erupted with cheers, clapping, and chanting his name. Marcus stood tall, his badge glinting in the fading light. The officers who had surrounded him now looked like shadows shrinking into the background. Their silence screamed louder than their earlier commands. News reporters who had arrived late pushed forward, cameras flashing, microphones reaching out. The story had grown bigger than the street. It was no longer just about one man and a group of officers. It was about something larger: truth, prejudice, justice, and the power of dignity. Marcus answered none of the reporters' questions. He simply looked around at the faces in the crowd, meeting their eyes, giving them strength with his calm presence. He nodded slightly, then turned back to the officers. You can walk away tonight pretending this was just a mistake. Or you can face the truth and admit that it was more than that. That's up to you. But know this: the truth always comes out. His words left the officers speechless. Their power was gone, stripped away not by force but by the strength of one man's calm courage. The tall officer finally dropped his gaze, no longer able to meet Marcus's eyes. The younger one who had admitted their mistake looked as though he wanted to say more, but he remained silent, too ashamed. The crowd began chanting Marcus's name. People raised their hands in applause. Children looked up at him with admiration, their eyes wide as if they were seeing a hero. For them, Marcus was not just a detective, he was proof that quiet strength could defeat loud arrogance. As the night deepened, the flashing lights of the patrol car dimmed against the power of the crowd's voices. The officers slowly backed away, trying to disappear into the shadows, their pride shattered. But Marcus remained in the center of the street, not as a victim, but as a symbol of justice. In that moment, he was more than a man with a badge. He was a reminder to everyone watching that truth is stronger than humiliation, that dignity can rise even from the harshest trials, and that courage does not always roar, it sometimes stands silent and unbroken until the right moment. The night after Marcus revealed his badge became one that people in the city would never forget. The videos spread quickly across social media. Within hours, millions of people had watched the humiliating scene, followed by the powerful reveal that the man the officers had stripped and mocked was, in fact, a decorated detective. The internet buzzed with outrage, sympathy, and support. Hashtags with Marcus's name trended everywhere, and news anchors replayed the footage on television, pointing out the shocking behavior of the officers and the calm dignity of the man they had tried to humiliate. Marcus himself, however, spent the night in silence. He returned to his small apartment, folded his clothes neatly, placed his badge on the table, and sat in the quiet. He thought of every face in the crowd, every voice that had shouted in anger or disbelief, every child who had looked up at him. He thought of how close he had come to being broken, and yet how he had held on. His heart was heavy but steady. He knew this was only the beginning of something larger than himself. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Newspapers carried headlines in bold letters. Some said detective humiliated by fellow officers in public. Others called it truth in his pocket, how a badge changed everything. The city's mayor was forced to speak, promising a full investigation. Community leaders demanded action. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Marcus, calling him a symbol of strength and dignity in the face of injustice. At the police headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. The officers involved were called in for questioning, their faces grim, their voices shaky as they tried to defend themselves. They used words like procedure and misunderstanding, but no one was convinced. The video had captured more than their actions, it had captured their intent, their pride, and their failure. Their superiors knew it, and so did the public. Meanwhile, Marcus walked into the precinct the following day, not as a broken man, but as a figure everyone now respected differently. Officers who had once overlooked him now stepped aside quietly, their eyes lowered as he passed. Some offered soft apologies, others avoided him completely. But Marcus did not gloat, did not lash out. He walked calmly to his office, set his badge on the desk, and began his work like any other day. Later that week, he was invited to a community hall meeting. Hundreds of people filled the large space, with reporters waiting outside. Children held signs that said, "Respect and dignity for all," and "Marcus is our hero." When he stepped onto the stage, the entire room erupted into applause. The sound was so loud it shook the walls. Marcus stood still for a moment, overwhelmed by the support. He raised his hand gently, and the crowd quieted. His speech was simple, spoken in the same calm, steady voice he had used on the street that night. "I want to thank you all for standing with me," he began. "But this is not just about me. This is about something bigger. What happened to me happens to many others, every day, though their stories are not always seen or recorded. Dignity should never be stripped away from anyone, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from." The crowd clapped, some wiping tears from their eyes. Marcus continued, "I had a badge in my pocket that night, and in the end, that saved me. But what about those who don't carry one? Who stands up for them? Who protects them from humiliation? We must do better. Not just as a police force, not just as a city, but as human beings." His words struck deeply. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping and chanting his name again. Marcus nodded humbly, then stepped down from the stage. He shook hands with elders, hugged children, and listened to the stories of people who had faced similar treatment. Each story fueled his determination, each tear reminded him of his responsibility. The days that followed brought big changes. The officers involved were suspended and later faced disciplinary action. New training programs were announced for the entire department, focusing on respect, equality, and communication. For the first time in years, the community felt their voices had been heard, and Marcus was at the center of it all. Despite the attention, Marcus remained humble. He still walked to work quietly, still greeted his neighbors with the same soft smile, still lived in the same small apartment. But everywhere he went, people stopped to thank him. Strangers shook his hand in the street. Parents lifted their children so they could see the man who had stood tall without raising a fist. One evening, weeks later, Marcus returned to the same street where everything had happened. The shops were busy, the sidewalks crowded, and life moved as if nothing had changed. Yet for Marcus, the memory of that night would never fade. He stood there quietly, watching people walk by, hearing the laughter of children, the voices of vendors, the hum of the city. And he thought of how close he had come to being humiliated beyond repair, yet how that moment had turned into something greater. As he stood, a little boy approached him with wide eyes. It was the same boy from that night, the one who had asked his mother why the officers were treating Marcus that way. The boy held out a drawing he had made, a picture of Marcus standing tall, with a shining badge on his chest. Underneath, in uneven letters, the boy had written, "My hero." Marcus knelt down, his eyes softening as he took the paper. "Thank you," he said gently. The boy smiled and hugged him before running back to his mother. Marcus watched them leave, his heart full. He looked up at the sky as the sun began to set, the same way it had on that night. The light spread across the buildings, warm and golden. Marcus took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Dignity is not given. It is lived." With that, he slipped his badge back into his pocket, not as a secret this time, but as a reminder of the strength he carried within. He walked away, his steps steady, his spirit unbroken. And though the city around him buzzed with noise and movement, Marcus knew his story would live on, not just as a moment of humiliation, but as a lesson in courage, patience, and the unshakable power of truth.